Hello, everybody. Welcome to Room and Board. I'm Zachary Groombridge, and this is the first episode of a brand new series. Welcome to the Rule Book Club. You see, there's lots of board games out there. There's games in bags, there's games in boxes, there's games that are just cards. There's games full of tokens and time tracks and tiles and dice. But there's tons of games out there that are just books. Just rule books full of rules. There are tabletop role-playing games, there are skirmish games, there are war games, and there's a whole ton of games out there that are rule books, are games, but don't really fit in any of those categories. So every episode, I will read a rule book. We'll let you guys know what rule book is going to be in the next episode if you want to read along. I don't actually expect anyone will, but this is a book club, so you should have the right to be able to follow along if you like. I'm going to be reading rule books, probably a lot of tabletop RPGs, but we'll try to get the biggest cross-section of the rule book world, and we're going to review them. We're going to analyze them. We're going to talk about what makes them interesting, why you might want to acquire them, why you might want to play them, why you might want to find someone who is already playing one of these games and get involved, or, just have something to talk about. So, in this first episode, we have not read a book for the Rule Book Club because this is our first meeting. But what I think we're going to do, because I think the first couple books we're going to go through on this show are going to be tabletop role-playing games. We're going to talk about sort of the criteria, the pillars of review that we're going to focus on while we review these games. So we sort of pre-discuss the context in which we're going to be going into these things, because tabletop role-playing games tend to be big, complicated, interconnected. They're a complicated artifact to examine. If we were going to focus on them in a simple way, I think we would shortchange a lot of the really interesting stuff that's in there. And I don't want every episode of this show to be an hour long. So we're gonna front load it a little bit. We're gonna talk about sort of the pillars we're gonna focus on, the focal points of our reviews going forward. And I think that a lot of these focal points are going to apply to non-tabletop role-playing games as well. I have a big stack of books I've been reading through in preparation for this show, and I think most of these pillars are going to apply to a couple of war games that I've been going through that I'd like to talk to you guys about. So to kick this thing off, let's talk about the ways we are going to talk about tabletop role-playing games. So our first pillar of review, the first thing we're going to focus on when we get a role-playing book and we look at it and we're going to start talking about it, what's the first sort of topic of discussion? And I think that has to be a conversation about what tabletop role-playing games are, right? It kind of says, I think if we go into a tabletop role-playing game or a review of one of these rule books expecting the wrong thing, we are going to look less favorably on these rule books, these systems, these products, than if we had gone in with a different mindset. So I think that the most basic form that a tabletop role-playing game is it's a book full of rules that govern a conversation, right? When you and your friends are getting together to play a tabletop role-playing game, you're really deciding to talk. You're to talk to your friends about a subject. You're talking about dungeons. You're talking about dragons. You're talking about running a cyberpunk dystopia. You're talking about surviving an apocalyptic wasteland. You're talking about fighting zombies in a mall. You're talking about hunting vampires in a Cold War setting, right? Whatever the conversation is around the table, you and your friends are getting together and you're deciding to talk about a thing, and the rules in a tabletop role-playing game, essentially, whatever else they are the rules that structure that conversation you have with your friends. And so I think that's our first pillar of review. What is the conversation like? What is the interaction between you and your friends that this rule book, this tabletop role-playing game, seeks to elicit? And I think that is super interesting. And there are games out there that make a really interesting conversation around the table happen between you and your friends, and don't do anything else well, but the actual conversation is strong enough that on its own merits, it's a good game. I think a lot of board games as well are sort of just vehicles to hang out with your friends, essentially. and whatever else that game brings to your group of friends is sort of a bonus. But yeah, so let's talk about like how does a tabletop role playing game sort of help structure a conversation. So in every conversation you ever have, there are rules, whether you realize there are rules or not. There are things that are polite, that are impolite. When you're getting together with people, there are things you know you're going to talk about that you can speak about with authority. There are things that you know that you can't speak about. And a tabletop role playing game book will tell you sort of the rules of engagement, the things that are polite. Tell every player around the table what they have authority to talk about in your conversation together about leopards and lemurs. And really good tabletop role playing game books also tell everyone around the table what to talk about when that conversation around the table has died. For example, a player jumps off a cliff in the tabletop role playing game, and the DM doesn't know what to respond with that. None of the other players around the table know how to respond to that. A good tabletop role playing game will step in, add to the conversation, tell everybody sort of what is going to happen next mechanically according to the rules, and kickstart that conversation all over again so that there's no lull at the table. So that is our first pillar of review. What kind of conversation do the mechanics, the rules, the setting, all of the things in this book, what kind of conversation does this tabletop role-playing game attempt to create? How does it support the creation of those conversations? How does it fail at that? If we were to look at a current, very popular tabletop role-playing game like Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, there are a lot of things that game wants to be a conversation about. Like if you read the rules, you get the implication that like, oh yes, tracking time and food and rations are very important in this game. But when you actually play that game, none of those things are actually particularly important, right? That's not actually part of the conversation. And so there's a disconnect in the rule book between the conversation that the game seems to present to you that you're going to be having and the conversation that you're actually going to be having around the table. So that's kind of interesting. That's going to be our first pillar of review. It's probably the most nebulous and hard to nail down of any of these pillars, but I think it's the most important. There are tabletop role-playing games like The Quiet Year, which essentially have no rules whatsoever. It is just a conversation engine. Everyone around the table knows the rules, and those rules just enable a lively, focused conversation on topic for about an hour and a half, right? Werewolf. I don't think the boxed game version of Werewolf, but like if you've ever played Werewolf on a forum, you essentially just get like a rules handout and it tells you how to play the game. And the entire game just exists as a conversation between you and other people. And there are lots of different versions of Werewolf out there. There's Mafia, all those things. And very slight changes in the rule set can make that very same conversation either very interesting or very boring, and it's a matter of inches. So that's our first pillar of discussion. When we talk about a role-playing game, that's going to be probably our most important thing, and we're not going to rank that on a pass or fail. We're not going to give it a 1 out of 10 scale. We're going to rank the conversation created by a tabletop role-playing game, or that it seeks to create, based on how sort of interconnected it is with the rest of the system. So you know what? We will give it a pass or fail. We'll be harsh. Cool. Our second pillar of discussion when it comes to reviewing tabletop role-playing games is going to be, I think, probably the most important for most people, and that is the setting of the game. The setting is super important in a tabletop role-playing game. When you're pitching a game to your friends, you're saying, hey, come over, we'll play this tabletop role-playing game. We'll set aside time every week for 4, 5, 10 weeks, and we'll play this game every week, and we'll build up our characters, and we'll build up our story. The pitch that you're really making to your friends is what that story is going to be, right? If you're pitching super spies hunting super spy vampires in the Cold War, that is like an interesting, powerful part of the setting, and that is the reason people are playing. People aren't playing the game because, oh, you get to roll a d20, oh, you get to roll a d100, oh, your stats are based on these 12 factors. None of that is part of your pitch when you're getting players to play a game. And when you're playing a game, the thing that's keeping you playing the game a lot of the time is sort of the quality of the setting. There's people who would play at a drop of a hat a Lord of the Rings themed role-playing game, but would not play a Dungeons and Dragons themed role-playing game. You know what I mean? Setting is incredibly important. Not least of which, but because in these tabletop role-playing games, let me get an example. They're huge. They're big, big books. And they're usually full of art. They're usually full of short stories, quotes from fictional in-world books. They have art on pages. Usually, like, even the page numbers get stylized. And all of that is part of the setting. When you open up the book, a good role-playing game book will transport you into the world that the game is trying to teach you how to recreate in your conversations around the table. A poor role-playing game book, as you read it, makes you feel like you're reading a rule book. A good role-playing game book, as you read it, it's trying so hard to transport you into that world, so that even when you're referencing the rule book in play, a good role-playing game book does not kick you out of the fiction that you're role-playing in. I think another really important part of this pillar of review is that a lot of people buy role-playing game books and never use them. They buy them, they put them on the shelf, they go on their coffee tables, and maybe they read through them just for the stories, the short stories, the art. As like a cool artifact to have in your home, a really beautiful role-playing game book is just a really cool thing. It's a cool thing to look at. It's a cool thing to read. It's a cool thing for guests to come over and they're waiting around in your apartment and they pick up the role-playing game book you have on your coffee table and they flip through it and they look at the cool pictures or they read a little blurb. I think for a lot of people in this world that have bought neat role-playing games, that is the function that a lot of them serve, right? Not everyone who buys, Pathfinder is going to be actively and aggressively playing it. And a lot of people who are intending to play the role-playing game that they've purchased, sometimes it takes a few years for you to get that group together. Sometimes you play a game right away and then you don't play that game for a couple years and it's sitting in your apartment, your house, and the value that it's giving you is not in the conversation it's creating. It's not in the cool mechanics or anything like that. It's in the setting, the imagination space it's presenting to you. I think it's really important for getting people to play the game. It's really important for making the game consistently interesting. And it's super important for it just being a useful and cool thing in your home. Another thing that I think makes the setting incredibly important and something to discuss is in a good role-playing game, the setting gets woven through every other aspect of the game. Much like our first pillar, all the mechanics should tie into the setting somehow. All of the different things the game wants to focus on should tie in. If you're playing a zombie role-playing game that's about making hard decisions and living in this bleak world, if none of the mechanics elicit that setting, let's say there's a phase in the game where you discuss where you're going to go and scavenge next. If that part of the game does not elicit being in a bleak world making hard decisions, then the setting is no longer part of the game. It's just something layered on top. And you can find a lot of role-playing games that use other game systems. For instance, there are a ton of role-playing games based on Dungeons & Dragons that basically use the core rules of Dungeons & Dragons, and they put their own setting on top of it, and they say, done. But there's a ton of setting woven into the rules of Dungeons & Dragons that people don't even realize. Subtle things like the reason you roll for certain things, the way you roll for certain things, the reason some rules exist and some don't. In Dungeons & Dragons, it's all eliciting sort of a setting. It's eliciting a feeling, a kind of world. It's creating a kind of conversation. In a lot of role-playing games that just use the Dungeons & Dragons rule set whole hog as a base, there's something off about the way they feel. And a lot of the time, it's because they're blindly using rules that are designed to elicit a setting that is not being used. And I think that's super interesting. So that is our second pillar of review, the setting. This is too complicated to give a pass-fail So we will be ranking this on a scale of 1 to 10. Let's go to our third pillar. The third pillar that we're going to be using to review these games, to focus on them, to discuss them, is going to be the game systems, the mechanics themselves. Now, tabletop role-playing games, even though they're called games, they contain multitudes, right? There are many games contained within many different role-playing games. To take the most common example, Dungeons & Dragons again, right? There is a solid tactical turn-based combat game in there. There can be a resource management survival game in there as you manage your food and your resources and your heals and your rests. There can be management games, taking care of entire cities or towns. There can be deduction games. There can be hidden role games. There is a tabletop role-playing game that uses a tower of Jenga, and that is a separate mechanic that just sort of contributes to the game. And there's more examples than this, right? A tabletop role-playing game often contains many sub-games with their own mechanics. And I think all of those are very interesting to talk about. There's games that have very weak sort of combat mechanics, but focus on investigation. There's games that focus on sort of management. Really, I played a tabletop role-playing game called Stars Without Number quite a while ago. And you can play that game in a whole bunch of different ways, but the way our group ended up playing it was basically creating a galactic mega trade corporation. In most game sessions, we sat down with spreadsheets and we figured out where we were going to buy resources from, who we were going to hire to move those around, and it became honestly like a business management simulator, right? And it was all supported by mechanics in the game. So that's our third pillar. We're going to talk about the mechanics of the game, the different games within the game. How interesting are they? How do they tie into the conversation? How do they tie into the setting of the game? And then also just how they stand on their own. Something that is very common in tabletop role-playing games for players, for game masters, for everybody, is there is a lot of lonely fun in them, right? Game masters get to go and build whole worlds, design enemies, design encounters, design dungeons, design mysteries, and they do all of that on their own using the mechanics of the game. And players often spend a ton of time planning out their character, planning out their class, their advancements, picking traits, and trying to figure out how they are going to develop their character. And that they do a lot of that on their own, between sessions, reading the rule book, really just sort of engaging with the mechanics in a solitary way. So that is another thing I really want to touch on with every book that we review, is what is the lonely fun aspect of these rule systems? Is there enough interest there that you can sort of fuel your exploration of the game between sessions? Because that is another thing with tabletop role-playing games. Often you're meeting weeks apart, days apart, weeks apart, months apart. Sometimes games get picked up after a year of not seeing your friends. And a lot of that intervening time can be filled up with really fun engagement with role-playing games without actually having anyone there. So those are the sort of two aspects of this sort of mechanical investigation into the rulebook. What sort of mechanics are in this game? How interesting are they? And how interesting are they to explore alone? And this is something I probably should have brought up in the first pillar, our what kind of conversation does this game create pillar. But because role-playing games create all these rules and a way of talking about make-believe in a way that structures it in a really interesting way and focuses it, in the same way that it can focus a conversation among friends, it can focus your quiet daydreaming, right? I have read a role-playing game book and never had a chance to play it with anyone, but the sort of the ethos, the way that role-playing game book talks about its setting, about its mechanics, about its world, really also creates a framework for you to sort of quietly explore that daydream imagining, what would this place be like, all just for yourself. And so I think the solitary aspect of the mechanics is as almost as important as how the actual game systems work and play. We're going to set aside our third pillar, and we're going to talk about our fourth pillar of review, and that is how this game actually wants to be used. I gotta think of names for all of these pillars, but we're gonna go 1, 2, 3, and 4. What I mean by how it actually wants to be used is there are role-playing games that have been written, that have been published, that have been sold and collected, that I'm not sure ever were actually intended to be played. And what I mean by that is, I think there's a lot of role-playing games that present 1 or 2 or 3 really cool ideas, really cool systems, really cool charts, really cool ways of running a city, or creating a dungeon, or exploring a cyberpunk future. And while those systems have had a ton of thought and work and intent put into them, the game around it feels a little lackluster. When I've seen those games, my first thought as a game master has always been, I love that system. I'm going to rip it out and plug it into another game. And I think there are tabletop role-playing games that get sold as like holistic, complete games, but actually are sort of demos of a bunch of mechanics to be used in other games, right? Stealing from different systems, stealing from different game systems, from different setting books, from different adventures is like how dungeon masters run games, how people play games. And I think there are tabletop role-playing games out there that are sort of built to be stolen from and not necessarily played as themselves. And I think that's one aspect of how is this game actually meant to be used? Is its best use to be played, or is its best use to be stolen from? I think another aspect is, especially nowadays, there's a ton of actual play role-playing game podcasts out there. A ton of people see them and assume that that's how role-playing games are played, right? There's a bunch of assumptions that are drawn, seeing professional actors role-play characters in a role-playing game podcast. And people say, like, that's how you play the game. This is how you act. This is the conversation you have. This is what the setting's about. This is what the mechanics feel like. It looks like these people playing. But a lot of those podcasts, YouTube shows, Twitch shows are, professional entertainers working their very best to entertain an audience. And a lot of the games they play tend to be ones that have enough like sort of open breathing room, enough space that they are able to entertain an audience, right? I've played with a lot of people whose first experience with role-playing games has been watching role-playing game shows on YouTube, listening to role-playing game podcasts. And they bring in a lot of assumptions about what a game is, what even is a role-playing game, that don't necessarily apply in an actual role-playing game experience. There are role-playing games that are sort of built more for the entertainment value as a production, as a show. There are some that are built much more for like a quiet group of people playing a game together on game night. And there are ones that run the gamut in between. The intent behind what a role-playing game is sort of built for can completely change how you approach it. Have I made any sense? I don't know. Listen, I'm rambling at a camera and I've never done this before. And I'm probably going to need to re-record this whole thing because I feel like I've skipped a bunch of things that were very important to talk about. But anyway, those are our 4 pillars of review. And going forward, that's what we're going to be using to examine all the tabletop role-playing games on this show. And I think most of these pillars apply to skirmish games, to war games. Yeah, so we'll see how this goes. Next time on the Rulebook Club, we're going to be reading and reviewing a very old game. It's not in print anymore. You can still get it as PDF on, I think, TTRPG and maybe some other places online. But I've played this game 4 years. I think it's the longest running campaign I've ever run. I know a lot about the system. The game, I think, has been replaced. There's a newer version made by a different company, same setting, attempts to do a similar thing. I have never read or played that, so that's going to be coming up on the show. And I know this is an old game, but because I have so much experience with it, I have a lot to say about it, and I think it's going to be interesting to talk about and to review. So next time, we're going to be talking about Fantasy Flight, Rogue Trader, the Warhammer 40k role-playing game. I've played a ton of this game. I think I had a 3-year campaign, but we won't stop there because I didn't also only play this. I also played Only War, the tabletop role-playing game, but Fantasy Flight, Warhammer 40k, but I didn't only play that. I played a bunch of Black Crusade, it's a tabletop role-playing game, Fantasy Flight. Warhammer 40k, but I didn't only play that. I also played a ton of Dark Heresy. I don't have the book for it. I also played Dark Heresy, the second edition. It's also by Fantasy Flight. Warhammer 40,000. For I feel like 5 years, Fantasy Flight put out versions of this game, exploring different aspects of the Warhammer 40k setting. I've played them all. I have lots of things to think and say about them all. They're very cool books, and that's going to be our focus for next time. So if you're reading along, don't worry about most of this. You can check out Rogue Trader, take a peruse through it, but I don't expect you to. That's what we're going to be talking about next time. And just to give you a heads up, might as well give you a preview of the next 2 episodes of the show. After Rogue Trader, we're going to take a quick diversion into the wargaming world, and we're going to look at A Billion Suns. I was going to make A Billion Suns the first episode, but I want to get some gameplays in just so I can fully understand what's going on there. It's very cool, though. So see you next time on the Rulebook Club.